Welcome to the Be Curious podcast, the podcast that champions solutions to some of the world's biggest problems. I'm your host, Louise Houghton, and in each episode, we get curious about a different subject, from the food we eat and the clothes we wear to overflowing landfills and ocean plastic. All of our guests have brilliant minds and innovative ideas to allow us to lead a more conscious, sustainable, and pollutant-free life. And the best part is, this podcast is not just about listening. It's about building a community and connecting like-minded individuals who are curious about alternatives to enhance their lives and the longevity of the planet. And if you're curious already and you want to find out more about the giveaways that we have on the show, then why not head over to our Instagram for more information? You can find out how to enter at BeCurious_podcast. Today, we're getting curious about our oceans and how we can protect and enhance ecological biodiversity. I'm sure many of you have seen these ugly oil and gas rigs that are offshore in the ocean. From the surface, they look pretty unsightly, but underneath is something that can be abundant, colorful, and an artificial reef. To talk more about this and many of the other ocean projects they have going on is the co-founder of Blue Latitudes, Amber Sparks. Thank you so much for joining me, Amber.
Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
It's a pleasure to have you. Now, would you like to start by just giving us a quick overview of what Blue Latitudes actually is?
Absolutely. So Blue Latitudes is a women-owned marine environmental consulting firm. We're marine scientists that work on repurposing offshore oil and gas platforms into permanent artificial reefs. We're not your typical marine scientists. We're working across the aisle with industry to look at these structures as potential reef habitats and give them a second life when they're done producing oil, using them to enhance our local ecosystems and be a place for new biodiversity to grow and thrive. We work both as a for-profit LLC, the Blue Latitudes LLC, that works as a consulting firm. So we work with oil and gas companies and with governments to assist them on looking at their platforms on a case-by-case basis to determine which structures would be viable reef habitats. And then we also have the Blue Latitudes Foundation, which is our 501c3 nonprofit that works on research, education, and outreach, especially around these unique ocean conservation opportunities that we find at the intersection of industry and the environment.
Definitely a unique intersection, and definitely a point I'm seeing where there's been so much more awareness that's been raised as to the destruction of our ocean reefs. I'm sure as a marine scientist, you've been well aware of this for a long time, but can you tell us a little bit more about how that has happened over time?
Absolutely. So our marine ecosystems are so fragile, yet so important. And our oceans cover 70% of our planet. They provide the oxygen for every other breath we take. There are coral reefs, kelp forests, and amazing ecosystems that support abundant life as well as life here on land. So they're so critical to living a healthy and productive life. But they're silent. They don't have a voice that can speak up to say, you're overfishing or polluting or destroying our environment. And so what we've seen is that over time, runoff, pollution, overfishing, global warming has caused the destruction of many of our natural reef environments.
And how does overfishing actually cause the destruction of a reef?
There are many different types of fishing activities. You could imagine like trawl fishing is taking a bulldozer the size of a football field and dragging it along the seafloor. And while you are picking up some sea-dwelling fish that you'd want to see on a dinner plate, you're also picking up a whole bunch of bycatch or species you're not intending to catch. That could include anything from small sea urchins on the seafloor to even picking up turtles or dolphins, things like that. And they all will perish and that get thrown back into the ocean. So that's one example of overfishing and that could negatively impact the environment.
And they would actually pick up parts of the reef as well?
Yes. So they can pick up parts of the reef. They can unintentionally, because they don't necessarily want to destroy a reef habitat that's providing a home for the fish they're trying to catch, but it can be an unintended consequence of trawl fishing.
And so why are the ocean reefs so important for marine life?
That's a great question. Reefs are critical for marine life. They not only provide a nursery ground and a home for fish, but they also provide food and they store carbon. So they're an important part of the carbon cycle and a critical ecosystem in our oceans.
What kind of fish will you find on a reef?
It depends on where your reef is. So if you look at a reef off of Southern California, we have colder waters. So you'll see cold water species. On a Southern California reef, you might find scallops, anemones, mussels, and then different types of fish species like the California Garibaldi, or so many amazing fish out in California's rocky reefs. But then in warmer waters, you're going to find colorful species, more warm water, bright colored fish that are associated with those reefs.
Yeah, like the tropical coral colored ones that you see on the front of your website, and you always associate when you think of a reef, even in the Disney movie.
Yes, yeah, exactly. Finding Nemo. Yeah, just imagine that. They pretty much nailed it.
And what does it actually mean when you hear that reefs are dead? The Great Barrier Reef, for example, we hear that a lot at the moment, that it's deteriorating and dying off.
Yes, so that's through a process called coral bleaching. Corals have a symbiotic relationship with this phytoplankton called zooxanthellae that lives within the bone skeleton of the coral. And the zooxanthellae are what provide life for the coral. Through that symbiotic relationship, they not only give it its color, but they also give it all of its life. But they're very sensitive to fluctuations in water temperature. And when the seawater gets warmer, the zooxanthellae can no longer survive. So they die. And what happens is that now the coral has lost its life source and it turns a bone white color, not only losing its ability to properly provide a home for the fish in the area, but it can no longer be a thriving reef as it once was.
And is it just the warmth, so climate change, that's affecting that, or are there other things as well in the ocean that we're seeing nowadays?
So corals can be destroyed not only through warming temperatures, but pollution can also cause the zooxanthellae to die off. We also see coral breakage through either people accidentally walking on them or being caught in a trawl. That will absolutely destroy that particular reef.
When you say pollution, is that sort of the plastics that we see in the ocean, or is that more kind of oil and things like that are being spilled from boats and ships?
What they're able to study right now is pollution from specific sources like runoff or being spilled off of a boat. But the impacts of the pollution from microplastics and all of the plastics in our oceans, we know that there is an impact, but we haven't quite yet been able to connect the arrow of how it's causing and damaging our coral reef ecosystems.
So was it this knowledge of the destruction and the pollution that made you want to do something about it?
As a marine scientist, much of the work that we do or that we study is about protecting our oceans. And so I was learning so much about how corals are being impacted and how that impacts life on land. And it can be a very negative and perhaps discouraging thing to study and devote your life to. But I never thought that my solution would be working with oil platform reefs. As a young girl loving the ocean, I thought maybe I'd work with dolphins or something a little bit more charismatic. But at my time studying the oceans at Scripps Institution of Oceanography for my master's, I learned that there were these thriving reefs growing on oil platforms, and I became very skeptical. Are those reefs truly valuable? Are they polluting our oceans? Is this truly something that could provide not only a reef habitat, but also a potential social or economic benefit to our state? And so I really dug into those questions for my thesis. And what I found is that in California, we have some of the most productive ecosystems below our oil and gas platforms.
So people were doing this before you were?
Yes, years before I was.
Oh.
The research is really being led by Dr. Milton Love out of UC Santa Barbara. And Dr. Love was one of my principal investigators on my thesis, worked with him and his team, gone out diving on these platforms. And that's when I really got to see firsthand what these reefs were.
So what is the potential reach for all of these reefs? How many of them are actually in the ocean?
So here in California, we have 27 offshore, but in the Gulf of Mexico, there are hundreds, and globally, there are thousands. I think right now the count is about 12,000 offshore oil and gas platforms.
Wow. So it doesn't matter if you've got a little competition then.
Yeah. Yes.
There's enough oil rigs
There,
out there.
exactly. Yes.
But they don't always stay still, do they? They move.
Some oil platforms can, yes. So there are several different types. There's a traditional fixed platform that's almost like the scaffolding of a building. And then there are those that are floating. So they'll have floating facilities or spars that are floating on the surface, and they can move them from place to place.
Can you tell us then about the process of installing an artificial reef?
The beauty of rigs to reef is that the reef is already there. We don't actually have to install anything. It's more repurposing the structure to take advantage of the marine life that's developed there over the lifetime of the platform. And so what we do is we'll work with the oil and gas companies. Once they're done drilling for oil, they seal and cap the wells, and then they can remove the upper portion of the platform or anything you see from your beach chair and retrofit the structure so that it can continue to function as a artificial reef.
So it doesn't happen when it's actually in use then, only once it's been used?
Yes. So this is kind of a unintended consequence. The oil and gas companies installed these structures, some of them 50 years ago, and they originally put them in the water to, of course, pump oil and gas. But these structures, the second you put structure into the water, it begins to attract life. And over time, small species will grow, and then you have a larger invertebrate community, and over time, fish and larger apex predators, sharks, will come and make it a full, vibrant reef. And so now, especially in California, our platforms that have been offshore for decades have thriving reefs that already exist and have been researched for over 30 years.
So it's not something that you actually put in a reef that looks artificial. It has to grow on its own accord.
These structures are unintended artificial reefs. An artificial reef will mimic the natural environment that it's placed. So it's a man-made structure that hosts natural marine life.
Now it makes a little more sense. I think in my mind I was thinking it, just looked artificial. It was a reef, but it's still classed as a home. But
yeah, so here the structure itself almost acts as the backbone. And on top of it will grow the corals and the different marine life that provide for a healthy, thriving reef. So the structure is just the black backbone on which it all grows and develops.
It's very ignorant, but I think sometimes in my mind, you don't think of the coral as being actually alive,
Yes.
Because it just is so stagnant, doesn't move like a fish or other living beings. And so you have to remember that this is actually growing on its own accord and providing all the nutrients and microorganisms a home.
Yes, exactly. And the work that we do has been termed rigs to reefs, but it's really rigs as reefs. These structures are already thriving reef ecosystems. And so what our work is to look at each structure on a case-by-case basis to determine which platforms and the reef habitats that have developed there are truly valuable and worth saving in the future.
What kind of benefits have you seen then from the work that you've done?
Well, in California, overfishing, pollution, runoff has depleted our nearshore environment and destroyed much of the nursery habitat for California rockfish. So what we found is that our 27 offshore oil and gas platforms have actually become a refuge for those rockfish. And the majority of rockfish are spawn bred and they grow to maturity on these platforms. So they act as a rockfish nursery ground and provide important habitat for that species. If those structures and the marine life and the reef habitat that they provide wasn't here, I'm not sure if we would have the rockfish in the bounty that we do today here in California. And another big win for the rigs to reef world is in the Gulf of Mexico, where a rig was converted as a permanent reef, and then National Marine Sanctuary boundaries of a protected area offshore in the Gulf was expanded to include that reef. So now it's a protected reef habitat moving forward.
Fantastic. And is that what you're wanting to do when you're working with the different rigs, to ensure that when they decide to move locations, that they leave behind a certain part of the rig that can be turned into the reef?
Yes. So we primarily work on these fixed structures. So you can imagine the scaffolding of a building that's placed solidly on the seafloor, and they're drilling wells into the seafloor directly. And once they're done with their drilling, they will seal and cap those wells. And then that scaffolding, the jacket structure, is what and where the marine life has grown and developed on. And so that is what will be repurposed. And when they reef it, they can either remove what you see from your beach chair and go down about 80 feet, which allows for ships to draft over, or they can take that structure and tow it to an area of ecosystem need, creating an artificial reef somewhere, or they will topple it directly on its side.
And I know you have a fantastic diagram on your website as well of what those kind of rigs look like and how you can see that the top bit will come off. So what is your website if you want to go and check out that image to get a clearer picture in their mind?
Yes, our website is bluelatitudesfoundation.org.
So oil and gas rigs are not the only thing that we see out in our oceans nowadays. We're also seeing a lot of other structures like wind farms. Could they be a potential for the same kind of concept?
Yes, absolutely. There are many parallels here because you're placing the same type of structure in the water that is likely going to attract marine life in a similar way to how the oil and gas platforms have, albeit the energy that's produced is much cleaner. So what we're working on doing is opening those communication channels with the offshore wind companies to let them know that they should think about decommissioning ahead of time. Think about it when they install. Plan on how are we going to remove these structures when they're covered with life? Or should we consider the placement of these structures in an area that could potentially enhance a local environment? And so those sort of conversations will hopefully help to inform offshore wind development so that it's not just producing energy, but also providing reef habitats for critical species in that area.
How long does that kind of conversation go on for before you kind of have a solid contract with them?
A long time. Quite a long time.
Too long.
Yeah, too long. Yeah, finding the right people to connect with, and really, they're worried about they have so many stakeholders to work with and understand diverse needs, whether it's fishermen to native tribes to scientists. So they're trying to find ways to place structures in the environment that are minimally impactful.
Now, Rigs to Reef is not the only project that you have going on with Blue Latitudes. Do you want to tell us more about FishLat?
Yes. So FishLat, or Fisheries Location Assessment Technology, is our software that helps with the impacts associated with removal, reefing, or future installation of an offshore structure. So it couldn't be applicable not only for oil and gas, but also offshore wind or any future development in the ocean. If we want to understand the impacts of placing something in the ocean, its impacts to the marine environment and to fisheries, we can use FishLat. It has a series of models that are informed by historical data, and it can predict those impacts, making it easier for both oil companies and governments to make the most informed decisions about how they're working in the marine environment.
Are you using satellite technology in order to get that data?
We are, yes. So FishLat is almost like a data lake. We're pulling data sources from so many different areas and research institutes. Satellites are an important component of that. We work with a company called Global Fishing Watch that has several satellites that are tracking fishing behavior in our oceans and helping us to understand where fisheries are and where they are not. And that information we're using to understand if we were to place a structure, how's that going to impact fisheries? Are they going to be attracted to that area? Is it not a place that they're going already? All of that made available through satellites.
That seems to kind of merge itself into the foundation work that you're doing as well, which is much more kind of research-based. Do you want to talk a little bit more about that side of things?
Yes. So through our foundation, we do education, outreach, and primary research on the value of structures as reef habitats. specifically, right now we're specifically researching artificial reefs here in California, looking at our oil platform reefs and understanding their value for critically endangered species such as the sunflower sea star, which has been found on oil and gas platforms. So we're trying to understand how many sea stars are there. Are they really using the oil and gas ecosystems as a place of refuge? Several years ago, there was a sea star wasting disease that spread out as south as Baja all the way up to Oregon, and it decimated many of the sea star populations. And what we've been finding is that the sea stars are rebounding. We're beginning to see them again in our tide pools and things like that, and we're also finding them on the oil platforms. So our research is looking at the presence of those sea stars and what does that mean for these structures as reefs.
Is a sea star like starfish?
Yes, there is many different species. The traditional starfish. We're looking at this sunflower star that's much larger. It has many more legs, and it's looks almost like a big sunflower. That's why it gets its name, the sunflower sea star.
There's so many species, isn't there, in the ocean?
Yes.
It's amazing.
Yes.
How to find names for them all.
I know. I think scientists have a lot of fun with that part.
I'm sure they do.
Yeah.
Now, what about the other projects that you're working on here in California? Do you want to tell us about the Malibu Oyster Project? I saw that one on your website and I was very interested in it.
Yes. So Malibu Oysters was a company that was looking at growing an aqua farm that is farming oysters here in the coast of California. And at this point, they haven't actualized it. We were assisting them sort of on the permitting side of things to help them to see how feasible it was to open that farm. Unfortunately, it takes a lot of capital on the front end to get that type of a farming institution up and running. But what we've found is that aqua farms are having a little bit more luck on the East Coast. So we've been working with some farms in the Gulf of Maine that are having these fabulous oyster farms. They are looking at really doing small-scale, local, community-led farming, and it's really beautiful to look at that and how they're able to kind of engage with the marine environment while also providing another source of food for their families.
East Coast are good for their oysters, I believe.
Yes, yeah.
I haven't known them to be grown in California before, this far south.
Yes, I know. I don't think so. Well, it's not impossible.
You get them in Washington, but certainly I've never seen it on a menu, California oysters.
That's true. Yes.
And what about the Catalina underwater art installation?
Yes. So we work on looking at structures that not only oil and gas platforms, but also other structures. So there was an art installation off the coast of Catalina Island where they placed structures on the seafloor, and then they, over time, looked at how the marine life colonized and enhanced their art. So at first, it was just a bare structure, but then over time, probably over the span of about a year, it had small colonizing species. So little anemones or soft corals, things growing all over the structure. And so instead of being a cement statue, it now had all this dimension and life to it. And that's really what an artificial reef does. It grows these ecosystems over time. And at first you see the small pioneering species, but if that structure were to be left in the water column for 10, 20, 30 years, over time it would be completely covered in life and really just be a part of the local ecosystem.
So interesting to have an art installation in itself down there. So it would be for divers or anybody going down into the waters off the island. Catalina.
Yes, yeah. So Catalina is known for its diving. It brings in tourists from around the world, and many of them are there to go to the kelp forests. But some of them maybe want to try out a new ecosystem or do a new exciting dive. And so, yeah, they could have gone and visited those art installations.
But it makes sense to me that any kind of structure that's in the ocean could actually become a potential reef then. So any sunken ships, for example, the Titanic,
Yes.
Many other structures that have been put into the ocean could actually become a home for the biodiversity down there.
Yes, absolutely. And off the coast of Florida, they are sinking tires off the coast of New York. They're throwing subway cars into the ocean. But the problem is that there's this fine line between artificial reefs and ocean dumping. And the materials that get placed into the water, we need to make sure that they are going to be sustainable and that we're not polluting the environment. So throwing tires, that material may not be the best, or a subway car has a lot of paint and things on it that could potentially be toxic.
Yeah.
And the beauty of the oil platform reef is that it's galvanized steel and it was placed in the water to be a sound structure that will not degrade over time and doesn't release minerals or toxins or things like that. It's just sort of like a pure form of metal. And so looking at what we're placing in our oceans and trying to understand what those implications are. It's a fine line.
Some positivity there to the ocean dumping.
Yeah, I know. But it is a fine line. And we get a lot of pushback on that with this rigs to reef concept, where people will look at it as ocean dumping. And if there was no reef growing on the oil platforms, I would maybe agree with them. But because there's already this marine life there, the reef has already developed. It's already supporting important life for, in some cases, decades. We're not necessarily talking about a structure anymore. We're talking about a reef. And so that's where the page kind of turns.
Yeah. Even if it is artificial, it's still doing what it needs to do, as opposed to, as you said, like rubber tires, which are probably disintegrating, and all of those bits of rubber are coming off into the ocean. The fish are eating them. We're eating the fish. They end up in our bodies.
Yes, exactly.
All these tiny bits of microplastics that we hear so much about these days. So with your research that you do, how big is your team?
We are a pretty small team, actually. It's myself here in Southern California, and then my co-founder is located in New Hampshire. And then we have one other full-time employee who's based in Georgia. So we're all remote but connected every single day. And then we work with several subcontractors who support us on specific projects.
Do you want to talk more about any of the other projects?
Yes. So some of the projects that we're really excited about right now are looking at unique reef structures in the Gulf of Mexico. The Gulf of Mexico, like I mentioned, has hundreds, if not thousands, of offshore oil and gas structures. Some of them are your traditional fixed platform, and some of them are floating, such as a spar. That's a floating facility that can go from place to place to do oil and gas extraction. But at some point, it needs to be decommissioned. And that's where we come in to look at it as a potential candidate to be reefed. And so that's a really interesting project that we're working on right now in the Gulf of Mexico, is looking at a spar as a potential reefing candidate and working with Departments of Fish and Wildlife in Texas and in Louisiana to identify a reef location for those spar facilities that would benefit the state and the local environment.
And can people volunteer to actually work with you at all?
Yes, we work with several volunteers. They usually help us with our outreach and engagement, or come on a dive with us to the oil platforms.
That's what I was wondering.
Yeah, we usually host a couple dives a year, and we try to bring out a diverse group of people to go and dive on the oil platforms here in California. They're publicly accessible, so anybody can really schedule a dive. You leave out of Long Beach, and their platforms, Eureka, Ellie, and Ellen, just right off Long Beach.
Where can people find out about those dives and everything that you do?
Our dives, if volunteers wanted to reach out to us, they can go to our website, bluelatitudesfoundation.org, or visit us on our Instagram, Blue Latitudes Foundation. We often will post when we have a big volunteer event, beach cleanup, or something of the like, where people can sign up and get involved.
I've definitely seen a lot on your Instagram. It's very good at educating people and getting them to understand what it is that you're doing. So definitely one to follow.
Okay, good. Yeah.
And Instagram is also where people can go to find out about the many giveaways that we have on the show as well. So just go to BeCurious_podcast if you want to see some of the monthly giveaways that we have and what's going for grabs in this particular time. Thank you so much, Amber. This has been such a wonderful conversation and so nice to see everything that you're doing and talk about the ecological biodiversity in our oceans.
Thank you so much for having me.
You're so welcome. So please do go to our Instagram, keep up to date with everything that we're doing. You'll see when this episode is coming out with Amber. And if you like it, please share and follow along. Until next time, everybody, my name is Louise Houghton, and stay curious.